From the very dawn of civilization, humanity has been shadowed by an invisible enemy, infectious disease. Pandemics, sweeping across vast regions and leaving trails of death and disruption, are as old as human society itself. Long before the modern understanding of germs and viruses, ancient peoples witnessed mysterious waves of illness that could wipe out entire communities within weeks. These early pandemics were often attributed to the wrath of gods, the alignment of celestial bodies, or the malevolent influence of unseen spirits. Yet, despite the lack of scientific knowledge, their impact on history was immense, shaping the rise and fall of empires, altering the course of wars, and transforming human behavior for generations. To understand the entire history of pandemics, we must begin in the deep past, in the early agricultural societies where human settlements first gave pathogens the perfect conditions to thrive. Around 10,000 years ago, the Neolithic Revolution marked a fundamental shift in human life. People transitioned from nomadic hunting and gathering to farming and permanent settlements. This change allowed for denser populations, close contact with domesticated animals, and shared water sources, a fertile environment for infectious diseases. Zoonotic diseases, those transmitted from animals to humans, began to emerge as humans lived alongside livestock such as cattle, pigs, and chickens. Diseases like smallpox and measles are believed to have originated in this period from viruses that once infected animals. With growing trade networks and expanding human contact, these early infections could spread far beyond their points of origin. The earliest recorded pandemic-like event comes from the Plague of Athens in 430 BCE during the Peloponnesian War. Athens, locked in a prolonged conflict with Sparta, suffered a devastating blow not from the sword but from disease. The historian Thucydides, himself a survivor of the outbreak, left a vivid account of the symptoms: high fever, inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the mouth, severe coughing, vomiting, diarrhea, and an unquenchable thirst. The disease struck without mercy, killing both the young and the old, the strong and the weak. It overwhelmed the city's medical resources, caused social breakdown, and led to lawlessness as people abandoned traditions and rituals in the face of certain death. While the exact cause remains debated, modern researchers suggest it could have been typhus, smallpox, or even an early form of Ebola-like virus. The toll was immense. As much as a quarter of Athens' population perished, including its great leader Pericles, altering the balance of the war and marking a turning point in Greek history. A few centuries later, during the Roman Republic and Empire, pandemics would again play a decisive role in shaping history. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 CE is among the most infamous ancient outbreaks. Likely caused by smallpox, this epidemic is thought to have been brought to Rome by soldiers returning from campaigns in the East. The physician Galen provided descriptions of the symptoms, including fever, diarrhea, and a distinctive skin eruption, which modern scholars interpret as consistent with smallpox. The Antonine Plague may have killed as many as 5 million people across the empire. Its effects were profound: manpower shortages in the army, economic strain, and a weakening of Roman political stability. The empire's ability to defend its vast borders diminished, and historians see this plague as a contributing factor to the slow decline of Roman supremacy. Not long after, the plague of Cyprian erupted in 249 CE, lasting until 262 CE. Named after Saint Cyprian, the bishop of Carthage, who chronicled its horrors, this pandemic caused daily death tolls so high that entire cities struggled to bury the dead. Victims suffered from diarrhea, vomiting, throat ulcers, fever, and gangrenous extremities. The disease, possibly a hemorrhagic fever or smallpox, spread through both the civilian population and the military, further destabilizing the already troubled empire. Yet, the Christian communities of the time earned admiration for their organized care of the sick. a factor historians believe contributed to the spread of Christianity during this period. If the Antonine and Cyprian plagues were catastrophic, the plague of Justinian in the 6th century was nothing short of apocalyptic. It stands as the first recorded instance of bubonic plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. The pandemic began in 541 CE in the Eastern Roman Empire under Emperor Justinian I and quickly spread through the Mediterranean world. Contemporary chroniclers like Procopius described horrifying scenes. Entire households wiped out, corpses piled in the streets, and the air filled with the stench of decay. The plague arrived in Constantinople via grain shipments from Egypt, which carried flea-infested rats, the vectors of the disease. Symptoms included sudden fever, chills, swollen and painful lymph nodes, buboes, delirium, and in many cases, rapid death within days. The death toll in Constantinople is estimated at 5,000 to 10,000 people per day at the height of the outbreak, and across the empire, the pandemic may have killed as many as 25 to 50 million people over 2 centuries of recurrent waves. The consequences of the plague of Justinian were enormous. The Eastern Roman Empire, already engaged in wars against the Goths in Italy, and facing pressure from the Persians in the east, found its military and economic strength severely diminished. Agriculture collapsed in many regions due to labor shortages. Trade slowed to a crawl, and tax revenues plummeted. Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire's former glory was dealt a fatal blow. Many historians argue that this pandemic shifted the course of European history, weakening Byzantine power and creating opportunities for the rise of Islamic empires in the centuries that followed. But pandemics in the ancient and early medieval world were not confined to Europe and the Mediterranean. In ancient China, disease outbreaks were also recorded with concern. During the Han Dynasty, various epidemics disrupted governance and trade. Some were so severe that they forced temporary halts in military campaigns. Similarly, in India, historical texts refer to devastating diseases that spread along trade routes, possibly linked to smallpox, which has been endemic in South Asia for thousands of years. The Silk Road, a great artery of cultural and economic exchange, also served as a superhighway for pathogens, allowing diseases to spread from one end of Eurasia to the other. In the Americas, though isolated from Eurasian pandemics until the arrival of Europeans in the late 15th century, there's evidence of localized epidemics affecting pre-Columbian societies. Some researchers speculate that crowd diseases may have arisen in large urban centers like Teotihuacan. Though without Old World livestock, the range of such diseases would have been more limited. Still, these early outbreaks could devastate local populations, especially in cities dependent on intensive agriculture and complex trade networks. By the end of the early medieval period, humanity had experienced multiple waves of pandemics, each leaving deep scars on societies. These events taught painful lessons. Though the medical understanding remained primitive, patterns began to emerge. People noticed that diseases often followed trade and war, that they could strike without warning, and that they did not discriminate between rich and poor. Religious interpretations remained dominant explanations, leading to both acts of charity and, tragically, to scapegoating and persecution of minorities in times of fear. In Constantinople, some blamed foreign merchants for bringing plague. In Athens, suspicion fell on enemies. In other regions, it was thought that divine punishment was at work. The first chapter of pandemic history, then, is one of both horror and adaptation. Cities implemented rudimentary public health measures, quarantine-like restrictions, closure of markets, and burial regulations. Communities learned to store food and water in preparation for times when labor shortages would cripple agriculture. Medical practitioners, though lacking germ theory, experimented with herbal remedies, dietary recommendations, and isolation of the sick. While the measures were often only partially effective, they represent humanity's earliest attempts to confront the invisible killers that would haunt the centuries to come. As we close part one of this journey through the history of pandemics, we stand at the threshold of one of the most infamous chapters in human history, the Black Death of the 14th century. The lessons of the ancient plagues, the societal collapses, and the resilience shown in their aftermath all set the stage for the next great wave of devastation. The story of pandemics is not merely one of death and disease. It is also a testament to human endurance, adaptation, and the relentless quest to understand and survive. The mid-14th century stands as one of the darkest periods in recorded human history, a time when death moved faster than armies and reshaped the entire social, political, and economic order of Europe. Known as the Black Death, this catastrophic pandemic swept through Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia between 1347 and 1353, killing an estimated 75 to 200 million people, perhaps as much as half of Europe's population. It is one of the most infamous pandemics ever recorded, not only for its staggering death toll, but also for its profound and long-lasting effects on the world. To understand the impact of the Black Death, we must look at the interconnected web of trade, warfare, and human migration that allowed this deadly plague to spread with such speed and devastation. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen responsible for the plague of Justinian centuries earlier. However, this new wave was more widespread and ferocious, riding the expanding trade routes of the medieval world. Originating most likely in the arid plains of Central Asia, where the bacterium lived in wild rodent populations, the disease made its way into the human sphere through fleas carried by rats. Mongol armies, traders, and caravans traveling along the Silk Road unknowingly ferried the disease westward, reaching the Crimean Peninsula by the mid-1340s. One of the most infamous episodes in the pandemic's spread occurred during the siege of the Genoese trading outpost of Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, in 1346. According to chroniclers, the Mongol forces besieging the city, themselves stricken by plague, catapulted the corpses of their dead over the city walls in what some historians regard as an early form of biological warfare. Whether or not this event truly initiated the spread into Europe is debated, but the timing coincided with the escape of Genoese ships carrying infected rats and fleas back to Mediterranean ports. From there, the disease spread rapidly along the sea trade networks. By October 1347, plague had reached Sicily, and within months, it appeared in Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. The following year, it moved northward into France, Spain, and England, then eastward into Germany and Scandinavia. By 1351, it had reached as far as Russia, leaving no corner of Europe untouched. The Black Death was not a single disease presentation. It manifested in three forms: bubonic, septicemic, and pneumonic plague. The bubonic form, named for the swollen, painful lymph nodes or buboes that appeared in the groin, armpit, and neck, was the most common. Victims also experienced fever, chills, headaches, muscle aches, and exhaustion. Death often followed within a week. The septicemic form, in which the bacteria entered the bloodstream, caused internal bleeding, purple skin discoloration, and rapid death, often within a day. The pneumonic form, which infected the lungs and could spread directly from person to person via droplets, was the deadliest, killing nearly all victims within days. Without antibiotics, which would not be discovered for centuries, mortality rates were extraordinarily high. Medieval society was utterly unprepared for such a calamity. Medical knowledge still rested largely on the teachings of Galen and Hippocrates, focusing on balancing the body's four humors. Physicians prescribed treatments like bloodletting, herbal concoctions, and aromatic substances to purify the air. Some believed the plague was caused by miasmous poisonous vapors rising from the ground or the sea, or by astrological alignments, such as the conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345. Religious interpretations dominated popular thinking. Many saw the plague as divine punishment for humanity's sins. This belief led to mass processions of flagellants, groups of penitents who traveled from town to town, whipping themselves to atone for the sins of the world. These processions sometimes brought the plague with them, spreading it to new areas. Fear and desperation also fueled darker social reactions. Jewish communities across Europe became scapegoats, accused of poisoning wells and spreading the plague. In towns across Germany, Switzerland, and France, anti-Jewish massacres erupted, wiping out entire communities in acts of brutal violence. These persecutions were not only acts of fear-driven hatred, but also opportunities for debt cancellation and property seizure, revealing how pandemics can amplify pre-existing prejudices and inequalities. The economic consequences of the Black Death were staggering. With so many dead, labor shortages became severe. Fields went unplowed, harvests rotted, and livestock wandered untended. Food production collapsed in many regions, leading to famine in some areas. Paradoxically, for surviving peasants, the labor shortage provided an unexpected opportunity. Wages rose and workers began to demand better conditions. Landowners, desperate for labor, were forced to make concessions, undermining the rigid feudal order that had defined medieval Europe for centuries. In England, attempts by the ruling elite to freeze wages and bind workers to the land led to unrest, culminating in events like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. In the long run, historians argue the Black Death accelerated the decline of serfdom and the transformation toward a more wage-based economy. Urban life also transformed. Many towns and cities experienced catastrophic population losses, sometimes over 50%. This depopulation created vacant properties and reduced overcrowding, which in turn improved living conditions for some survivors. Yet cities also remained vulnerable to recurring outbreaks, as the plague did not disappear after its initial wave. It returned in cycles throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, each recurrence killing thousands more. The disease became an accepted, if dreaded, part of life, much like seasonal influenza is today. Culturally, the Black Death left a deep imprint on European art, literature, and religion. The omnipresence of death gave rise to the macabre imagery of the Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, a motif depicting skeletons leading the living to their graves, regardless of social class. Writers like Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron captured the human reactions to the plague fear, greed, piety, and indulgence in vivid stories framed by the experience of young nobles fleeing plague-stricken Florence. The trauma also deepened religious devotion for some, while causing others to question the Church's authority as prayers and rituals failed to stop the disease. Some historians see in this crisis the seeds of the later Reformation. As the plague undermined trust in established religious institutions, the Black Death also altered global trade and geopolitics. The decimation of populations reduced demand for goods, and in some regions, trade routes became less active. However, in the long term, the reduced population led to economic restructuring, increased wages, and technological innovation as societies sought to compensate for lost labor through improved tools and techniques. In the Middle East, the plague weakened the Mamluk Sultanate, while in China, the Yuan dynasty suffered massive population loss, contributing to its eventual collapse and the rise of the Ming dynasty. The Mongol Empire, already fragmenting, saw its vast trade network disrupted, marking the end of the era when Eurasia had been connected under one overarching political order. Yet, despite its horrors, the Black Death also brought certain unexpected transformations. Survivors inherited land and wealth, redistributing resources across society. Guilds, faced with the loss of skilled artisans, opened membership to new individuals, breaking down some of the rigid structures of medieval urban life. The scarcity of labor pushed for innovations in agriculture, such as the introduction of new crop rotations and more efficient plowing techniques. The reduced population also meant less pressure on the environment. Forests regrew in abandoned fields, and wildlife flourished temporarily in the populated regions. By the mid-15th century, Europe was slowly recovering from the demographic shock of the Black Death, but the plague had become a recurring feature of life. Major outbreaks in 1361 to 1362, 1369, and later years reminded everyone that the specter of sudden mass death still loomed. City governments began to develop more systematic responses. Venice, for example, established the first formal quarantine stations, lazarettos, on islands in its lagoon, where arriving ships and travelers had to wait 40 days, quarantining the city. This innovation marked an important step in public health, as it recognized, however imperfectly, the principle of isolating potential carriers to protect the wider population. The Black Death's impact reached far beyond its own century. It reshaped economies, weakened feudal structures, altered religious life, and left a lasting cultural legacy that can still be seen in art and literature today. It also served as a grim reminder of humanity's vulnerability to disease, a lesson that would echo in later centuries when new pandemics emerged. As Europe moved toward the Renaissance, with its rebirth of art, science, and exploration, the memory of the plague remained embedded in collective consciousness. In some ways, the very drive to understand the natural world, an impulse that fueled the scientific revolution, can be traced back to the deep scars left by the Black Death. As part 2 of our journey ends, the stage is set for a new era of exploration and conquest, one that would bring unprecedented encounters between distant peoples. These encounters would also unleash pandemics on a scale never before imagined, particularly in the Americas, where entire civilizations would be brought to the brink of extinction by diseases carried across the oceans. The next chapter in the history of pandemics will take us into the age of exploration, where the meeting of old world and new would create one of the most devastating biological exchanges in human history. By the late 15th century, the world was on the verge of a new era. The long recovery from the Black Death had reshaped European society, sparking a hunger for exploration, trade, and expansion. Advances in navigation, shipbuilding, and cartography enabled European explorers to venture farther than ever before, seeking new trade routes to Asia and beyond. Yet as caravels and galleons crossed oceans, they carried more than spices, silver, and silk. They carried microbes, tiny stowaways, invisible to the human eye, that would forever alter the course of human history. This period, known to historians as the Age of Exploration, also marked the beginning of the Columbian Exchange, the massive transfer of plants, animals, people, culture, and most devastatingly, diseases between the Old World and the New. While this exchange enriched some parts of the world and diversified diets on a global scale, it also triggered one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in recorded history, particularly for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Before European arrival, the Americas were home to tens of millions of people, living in sophisticated civilizations with their own political systems, agriculture, architecture, and trade networks. From the vast Inca Empire in South America to the Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, from the Mississippian mound-building cultures to countless smaller societies, these civilizations had thrived for centuries in relative isolation from Eurasia and Africa. This isolation had profound implications for disease resistance. In the Old World, centuries of close contact with domesticated animals like cattle, pigs, and chickens had exposed populations to a range of pathogens, including smallpox, measles, influenza, and plague. Repeated outbreaks over generations had led to the development of partial immunity in many communities. In contrast, the indigenous peoples of the Americas had few domesticated animals and had never been exposed to these Old World diseases. As a result, when European explorers and colonists arrived, they brought with them pathogens to which native populations had no biological defense. The first recorded pandemic of this new global era struck shortly after Christopher Columbus's voyages. While smallpox would later become the most infamous of these imported diseases, measles, influenza, and typhus also played devastating roles. Smallpox, caused by the variola virus, was especially lethal. Spread through respiratory droplets or direct contact, it produced fever, rash, and pustules, leaving survivors with pitted scars and sometimes blindness. In Old World societies, smallpox could be deadly, but often spared many adults who had survived childhood infections. In the New World, where the disease was utterly new, mortality rates soared to unimaginable levels. One of the earliest large-scale smallpox outbreaks in the Americas occurred in 1518 in the Caribbean, likely brought by ships arriving from Spain or West Africa. It tore through the indigenous Taino population of Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and other islands, killing a majority within just a few years. Entire communities vanished, and survivors faced the added horrors of enslavement and displacement. This early devastation set the stage for what would happen on the mainland when European expeditions moved deeper into the Americas. In 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes landed on the coast of present-day Mexico, beginning his campaign against the powerful Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, under Emperor Moctezuma II, initially engaged in cautious diplomacy with the newcomers, but tensions quickly escalated into conflict. While Spanish weapons, horses, and alliances with rival indigenous groups played important roles in the conquest, the decisive factor was disease. In 1520, smallpox erupted in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, likely introduced by an African slave in the entourage of Panfilo de Narvaez, a Spanish rival of Cortes. The disease spread with lightning speed through the densely populated city and surrounding regions. Chroniclers described the horrifying scenes: people covered in painful sores, unable to move, abandoned in their homes, bodies piled in the streets, the stench of decay filling the air. The epidemic killed an estimated half of the city's population within months, including the newly crowned Emperor Cuitlahuac. Weakened by such massive loss of life, the Aztec resistance collapsed, and by August 1521, the Spanish had captured Tenochtitlan. Smallpox, more than steel or gunpowder, had conquered the empire. Farther south, the Inca Empire suffered a similar fate. In the late 1520s, smallpox spread into the Andes, likely carried overland from Central America by traders or messengers long before Europeans themselves reached the region. The disease struck with devastating force, killing the Inca ruler Huayna Capac and much of the royal court. The resulting succession crisis plunged the empire into civil war between Huáscar and Atahualpa. When Francisco Pizarro and his small band of Spanish conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, they found an empire already destabilized and demoralized by disease and political turmoil. This internal division, compounded by further epidemics of measles and typhus, made Spanish conquest far easier than it would have been otherwise. The toll of the Columbian exchange pandemics was staggering. Some scholars estimate that the indigenous population of the Americas declined by as much as 90% within a century of European contact. This collapse was not the result of a single disease, but of successive waves of infections: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, and later, even bubonic plague, each striking populations already weakened by previous outbreaks, malnutrition, and the disruption of social structures. In North America, diseases often spread far ahead of European settlement. Trade networks and migration carried pathogens deep into the interior, devastating communities that had not yet seen a single European face. Archaeological evidence and oral traditions suggest that epidemics preceded explorers in regions like the Mississippi Valley and the Great Plains, reshaping the demographic and political landscape before colonization even began in earnest. While the New World bore the brunt of these pandemics, the Old World was not immune to the consequences of global contact. In the opposite direction, A disease called syphilis appeared in Europe shortly after Columbus' return from his first voyage in 1493. The origins of syphilis remain debated, but the Columbian hypothesis suggests it was brought from the Americas to Spain by returning sailors, then spread rapidly across Europe. The first recorded outbreak occurred among French troops besieging Naples in 1495, leading to the disease being nicknamed the French disease by Italians and variously blamed on different nationalities depending on where it appeared. Syphilis in its early European form was far more virulent than it would later become, causing severe sores, tissue destruction, and often death within months. Over the following centuries, it became a chronic, less acute infection, but it never lost its social stigma or its place as a reminder that pandemics could flow in both directions across the Atlantic. The age of exploration also brought pandemics through the transatlantic slave trade. Ships transporting enslaved Africans to the Americas became vectors for diseases such as yellow fever and malaria, which thrived in tropical environments. Yellow fever, caused by a virus transmitted by Aedes aegypti mosquitoes, caused high fever, jaundice, bleeding, and often death. It became endemic in parts of the Caribbean and the Americas, posing a constant threat to both enslaved and free populations. Malaria, caused by Plasmodium parasites and spread by Anopheles mosquitoes, took a heavy toll, particularly in coastal regions and swampy areas. Over time, some African populations developed partial genetic resistance to malaria through traits such as sickle cell, but indigenous and European settlers suffered high mortality rates. In the Pacific, European exploration and colonization in the 18th and 19th centuries introduced similar epidemics to island populations. Captain James Cook's voyages to Hawaii, Tahiti, and other islands brought not only goods and ideas, but also smallpox, measles, and influenza, which caused catastrophic losses in populations with no prior exposure. The demographic collapse of Pacific Island societies mirrored the earlier devastation in the Americas, fundamentally altering cultural traditions, political structures, and economic systems. The Columbian exchange pandemics highlight a critical truth about global history. The movement of people inevitably means the movement of their pathogens. In the early modern period, when ships connected continents for the first time in human history, the speed and scale of disease transmission leapt to a new level. This was a world without vaccines, without antibiotics, without even an understanding of microbes. Responses to pandemics remained rooted in older beliefs, miasma theory, divine punishment, and astrology, but some proto-scientific measures began to take shape. Quarantine practices became more widespread, and port cities developed systems to inspect ships and isolate suspected cases. Yet these measures were often inconsistent and ineffective against diseases that could travel in asymptomatic carriers. By the 17th and 18th centuries, smallpox had become a global scourge, affecting populations on every inhabited continent. In Europe and Asia, where it was endemic, it remained a major cause of childhood mortality. In the Americas, Africa, and the Pacific, it continued to cause devastating epidemics whenever it entered a population with little immunity. Attempts to control the disease led to the development of variolation, an early form of inoculation practiced in parts of Asia. And Africa for centuries, in which material from smallpox sores was introduced into the skin of healthy individuals to induce a mild infection and subsequent immunity. Variolation was brought to Europe in the early 18th century, where it gained both advocates and detractors. Though risky, it could cause severe illness or death. It marked the beginning of humanity's first deliberate attempts to control a pandemic through immunization. As the age of exploration transitioned into the Enlightenment era, the lessons of the Columbian exchange pandemics began to shape new approaches to public health, science, and governance. Yet the microbial world still held many more surprises. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of modern urban life would create new conditions for pandemics. while the expansion of imperial powers would spread diseases into every corner of the globe. The next great wave of pandemics would be driven not by the meeting of continents for the first time, but by the rapid, sustained movement of people, goods, and armies in an increasingly interconnected world. By the dawn of the 19th century, the world was transforming at a pace never before seen in human history. The Industrial Revolution, first emerging in Britain in the late 18th century, spread rapidly across Europe and North America, reshaping economies, landscapes, and daily life. Steam engines powered factories and locomotives. Coal smoke darkened the skies of expanding cities, and people poured into urban centers in search of work. Empires stretched across the globe, linking distant continents through networks of trade, migration, and military conquest. Yet along with the goods and technologies of industrial civilization traveled the diseases that had plagued humanity for centuries, now moving faster, striking harder, and reaching more people than ever before. The Industrial Age was a time when pandemics became both more visible and more deadly. But it was also a time when scientific understanding began to catch up with the invisible microbial world, laying the foundations for modern public health. Perhaps the most notorious pandemic disease of the early Industrial Age was cholera, a bacterial infection caused by Vibrio cholerae that spreads through contaminated water and food. Cholera had existed for centuries in the Ganges River delta of India, where it was endemic, but it did not become a global scourge until the 19th century. The trigger was the expansion of British colonial rule in India, which disrupted traditional water systems, increased travel and troop movements, and created ideal conditions for the disease to spread. In 1817, the first recognized cholera pandemic began in Bengal and quickly radiated outward, following trade routes along rivers and across oceans. Within a few years, it reached Southeast Asia, the Middle East, East Africa, and parts of Europe. Cholera struck with terrifying speed. Victims could go from healthy to dead in a matter of hours, their bodies dehydrated by relentless vomiting and diarrhea, their skin turning blue from circulatory collapse. The first pandemic faded in the 1820s, but cholera returned again and again over the century in a series of at least 6 global waves. The second pandemic, 1829 to 1837, reached Europe and the Americas, carried by ships and overland transport. In Britain, the disease struck major cities like London, where cramped slums, poor sanitation, and contaminated drinking water created a perfect breeding ground. The public response was often panic mixed with suspicion. Riots broke out in some places as residents blamed doctors or the authorities for deliberately poisoning the poor. The third pandemic, 1846 to 1860, was particularly deadly, hitting Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. It was during this wave that one of the most important breakthroughs in epidemiology occurred. In 1854, a severe outbreak struck the Soho district of London. Dr. John Snow, a physician skeptical of the prevailing miasma theory, which held that diseases were caused by bad air, conducted meticulous mapping of cases and traced the source to a contaminated public water pump on Broad Street. His decision to remove the pump handle is now legendary, though the outbreak was already waning. More importantly, his work provided compelling evidence that cholera was waterborne, helping to shift scientific opinion toward germ theory in the decades that followed. Despite Snow's findings, many cities were slow to overhaul their sanitation systems, partly because building modern sewer and water networks required enormous investment. But as cholera and other waterborne diseases continued to kill thousands in urban centers, reform movements gained momentum. In Britain, Edwin Chadwick's 1842 report on the sanitary conditions of the laboring population highlighted the connection between poor living conditions and disease, spurring the creation of public health boards. In the United States, outbreaks in cities like New York and New Orleans led to similar efforts. By the late 19th century, advances in engineering, combined with political pressure, brought cleaner water and better sewage disposal to many cities, drastically reducing cholera's reach in the developed world. Still, the disease remained a constant threat in regions without such infrastructure, and it continues to cause deadly outbreaks in vulnerable communities today. While cholera was the most feared waterborne killer of the industrial age, it was far from the only threat. Typhus, caused by Rickettsia prowazekii and spread by lice, thrived in the crowded, unhygienic conditions of prisons, workhouses, refugee camps, and military barracks. Known as jail fever in England and camp fever during wartime, typhus caused high fever, rash, delirium, and often death. In the Napoleonic Wars, it killed more soldiers than combat did. Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia was decimated not only by winter, but by typhus and dysentery. The disease also ravaged civilian populations during famines and forced migrations, striking Europe repeatedly throughout the 19th century. Unlike cholera, which could sometimes be curbed by improving water supplies, typhus required controlling the lice that spread it, a challenge in an age before insecticides and antibiotics. Tuberculosis, or TB, was another relentless killer of the industrial age. Caused by the bacterium Mycobacterium tuberculosis, it had been a scourge of humanity for millennia, but urbanization gave it new opportunities to spread. TB thrives in crowded, poorly ventilated spaces, and 19th century cities were full of such environments: tenement, housing, factories, and workshops. Known as consumption for the way it seemed to consume its victims, TB caused chronic cough, fever, weight loss, and eventually death. It struck rich and poor alike, though poverty greatly increased risk. Unlike cholera or typhus, TB often progressed slowly, allowing it to spread widely before symptoms became severe. Romanticized in art and literature, think of the pale, wan heroines of operas and novels. TB, nonetheless, was a grim reality, killing millions each year. In the late 19th century, the discovery of the TB bacterium by Robert Koch in 1882, part of the broader revolution in germ theory, opened the door to better diagnosis and eventually treatment, though a truly effective cure would not come until the mid-20th century with the advent of antibiotics. The industrial age also saw smallpox remain a major threat, though the introduction of vaccination began to change the landscape. In 1796, Edward Jenner had demonstrated that inoculating people with cowpox could protect them from smallpox, a safer method than variolation. Over the 19th century, vaccination campaigns spread across Europe and its colonies, though often met with resistance from those who distrusted the practice or resented government mandates. Despite opposition, vaccination significantly reduced smallpox mortality in many regions, and by the early 20th century, it was one of the few diseases humanity had begun to control on a global scale. The expansion of empires and the movement of armies meant that pandemics could be sparked or accelerated by war. The Crimean War 1853-1856 brought cholera outbreaks among both soldiers and civilians. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, saw deaths from measles, dysentery, and typhoid fever far outnumber those from battle wounds. Colonial campaigns in Africa and Asia often spread diseases between regions that had never previously encountered them. This pattern was magnified on an unprecedented scale during the First World War. The Great War, 1914 to 1918, mobilized millions of soldiers from across the globe, cramming them into trenches, ships, and transport trains where diseases could flourish. Yet the deadliest pandemic of this period did not originate in the battlefield trenches, but in a viral mutation. In the final year of the war, a new strain of influenza emerged and spread with terrifying speed, infecting an estimated 1/3 of the world's population and killing at least 50 million people, possibly far more, in what became known as the 1918 influenza pandemic or Spanish flu. The name was a misnomer. Spain, being neutral during the war, had a free press that reported on the outbreak, making it appear more prevalent there. In reality, the virus, now believed to have been of avian origin, likely began in military camps in the United States of France, spreading rapidly through troop movements. Unlike most seasonal flu strains, the 1918 virus was especially deadly to young, healthy adults. This unusual pattern is now thought to have been caused by a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system that damages the body's own tissues. Victims often developed severe pneumonia, their lungs filling with fluid, leading to death within days. The sheer speed of its spread overwhelmed health systems, and in many places, there were not enough coffins or gravediggers to keep pace with the dead. Cities closed schools, theaters, and churches. Masks became common in public, and public gatherings were banned in attempts to slow transmission. Despite these measures, the flu came in multiple waves over 1918 to 1919, with the second wave in the autumn proving the most lethal. The impact of the 1918 pandemic was profound. It killed more people in a year than the First World War had in 4 years. It disrupted economies, orphaned millions of children, and left long-lasting health effects on survivors. Yet it also spurred new interest in virology, public health, and international disease surveillance. The League of Nations established a health organization in the 1920s to coordinate efforts against such threats, a precursor to the World Health Organization. Still, in the decades that followed, pandemics would continue to emerge. The influenza virus itself never went away, mutating constantly and causing seasonal epidemics and occasional pandemics in later years, such as the 1957 Asian flu and the 1968 Hong Kong flu. In the aftermath of the industrial age pandemics, science had made major strides. Germ theory, firmly established by the work of Pasteur, Koch, and others, had given humanity a clearer understanding of how diseases spread and how they might be prevented. Public health infrastructure had expanded, with sanitation systems, vaccination programs, and disease reporting becoming standard in many countries. But the microbial world remained a step ahead in many respects. The next century would bring even faster transportation, denser cities, and more complex global trade networks conditions that would allow new pathogens to spread across continents in days rather than months. The modern era would see both humanity's greatest triumphs over disease and some of its most sobering defeats. By the middle of the 20th century, humanity had begun to feel a cautious optimism in its struggle against infectious disease. The introduction of antibiotics in the 1940s had turned once fatal bacterial infections into treatable illnesses. Mass vaccination campaigns were reducing or eliminating diseases like polio, diphtheria, and measles in many parts of the world. In 1980, the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated, the first, and so far only, human disease to be wiped from the face of the earth. Public health experts and politicians alike began to speak of a future in which infectious diseases would be a minor nuisance rather than a major killer, with chronic, non-communicable diseases like cancer and heart disease taking center stage. But even as these hopes grew, new and ancient pathogens alike were preparing to remind humanity that the microbial world had not surrendered. The closing decades of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st would see a cascade of new pandemics and epidemics, each shaped by the forces of globalization, technology, and ecological change, and each challenging the belief that humanity could ever fully tame the microscopic threats in its midst. The first and perhaps most transformative of these modern pandemics was HIV/AIDS. In the early 1980s, doctors in Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco began reporting cases of a rare form of pneumonia, Pneumocystis carinii, now P. girovesi, and unusual cancers like Kaposi's sarcoma in young men, many of whom were gay. Soon similar illnesses were observed among intravenous drug users, hemophiliacs, and others receiving blood transfusions. By 1983, Scientists had identified the cause, a retrovirus that attacked the immune system, later named human immunodeficiency virus, HIV, spread primarily through sexual contact, contaminated blood, and from mother to child during birth or breastfeeding. HIV gradually destroys the body's defenses, leading to acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS. Without treatment, AIDS left patients vulnerable to opportunistic infections and cancers that a healthy immune system could normally control. HIV/AIDS spread rapidly around the globe, particularly devastating sub-Saharan Africa, where it became the leading cause of death for adults in the 1990s and early 2000s. In many countries, the pandemic decimated entire communities, orphaned millions of children, and deepened poverty. In its early years, the disease was heavily stigmatized, often framed as a gay plague or a problem confined to marginalized groups, which slowed public health responses and contributed to discrimination against those living with HIV. Activists fought to change this narrative, demanding faster research, better access to treatment, and an end to discriminatory policies. Their efforts, combined with breakthroughs in antiretroviral therapy, ART, in the mid-1990s, transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition for those with access to medication. Still, inequalities in healthcare access meant that in many parts of the world, particularly in poorer countries, the toll remained staggering. Even today, more than 38 million people live with HIV, and while new infections have declined, the virus continues to spread, particularly among vulnerable populations. While HIV/AIDS redefined the modern pandemic landscape, other pathogens were making headlines in shorter, more acute outbreaks. In 2002, a new respiratory disease emerged in Guangdong Province, China, caused by a previously unknown coronavirus. Severe acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, spread to multiple countries within weeks, carried by air travelers. Patients developed high fever, cough, and in many cases, rapidly progressing pneumonia. The virus was highly transmissible in healthcare settings, leading to large clusters among hospital workers. Through aggressive public health measures, including quarantine, contact tracing, and travel advisories, SARS was contained within months, with fewer than 8,500 reported cases and about 800 deaths. But the episode was a warning. In the age of jet travel, a novel pathogen could cross the globe in days, and the world's preparedness systems were patchy at best. Just over a decade later, another novel coronavirus emerged, this time in the Middle East. Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, MERS, first identified in Saudi Arabia in 2012, was traced to transmission from camels to humans. MERS had a higher fatality rate than SARS, killing about a third of known patients, but it was less easily transmitted between people, which limited its spread. Most outbreaks were linked to healthcare settings in Saudi Arabia and South Korea, but the virus remains a concern, with sporadic cases continuing to appear. Meanwhile, influenza, humanity's old adversary, returned in new forms. In 2009, a strain of H1N1 influenza virus emerged in Mexico and quickly spread worldwide. Dubbed swine flu because of its genetic links to influenza viruses in pigs, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic was notable for its rapid spread, but relatively low mortality compared to the catastrophic 1918 flu. Still, it infected an estimated 24% of the global population in its first year, killing hundreds of thousands and overwhelming healthcare systems in many places. The 2009 pandemic underscored the unpredictability of influenza viruses, which constantly mutate and can exchange genetic material between human, avian, and swine hosts to create novel strains. Other pathogens demonstrated how environmental and socio-economic changes could create new pandemic threats. In 2014, West Africa faced the largest Ebola outbreak in history. Ebola virus disease, first identified in 1976, causes severe hemorrhagic fever with a high fatality rate. Previous outbreaks had been small and contained, but in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, the virus spread in densely populated urban areas for the first time. Weak health infrastructure, mistrust of authorities, and slow international response allowed the epidemic to spiral, eventually causing more than 11,000 deaths. Though Ebola is not easily spread through casual contact, its high mortality, gruesome symptoms, and the images of hazmat-suited workers burying the dead captured global attention. The epidemic prompted reforms in outbreak response, including the creation of rapid deployment teams and the development of an effective Ebola vaccine, which was deployed in later outbreaks in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The 21st century also saw the reemergence of vector-borne diseases in epidemic form. Zika virus, first identified in Uganda in 1947, caused a large outbreak in the Americas in 2015-2016, spread by Aedes mosquitoes. Zika typically caused mild symptoms in adults, but during the outbreak, it was linked to microcephaly and other severe birth defects in babies born to infected mothers. The association between a mosquito-borne virus and congenital brain damage was unprecedented, leading to widespread public concern and changes in pregnancy planning in affected regions. Efforts to control the outbreak focused on mosquito control and public education, and while cases have declined, Zika remains a threat in tropical regions. All of these outbreaks set the stage for the most disruptive pandemic since 1918, COVID-19. In late 2019, cases of a mysterious pneumonia began appearing in Wuhan, China. The cause was soon identified as a novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, closely related to the SARS virus, but with important differences. Unlike SARS, COVID-19 was highly transmissible, even before symptoms appeared, making containment far more difficult. Within weeks, the virus had spread to every continent, and by March 2020, the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic. Governments imposed unprecedented measures, lockdowns, travel bans, mask mandates, and the closure of schools and businesses. Hospitals in many countries were overwhelmed, and global supply chains faltered. COVID-19 caused a staggering death toll, over 6 million reported deaths by official counts, with excess mortality suggesting the true toll was far higher. It also left millions with long-term symptoms, known as long COVID. Yet the pandemic also demonstrated the potential of modern science. Within less than a year, multiple vaccines were developed, tested, and authorized for emergency use, including novel mRNA vaccines that proved highly effective at preventing severe disease. The rollout of these vaccines, while uneven and marked by inequities between rich and poor nations, saved millions of lives. The pandemic accelerated trends in telemedicine, remote work, and global health surveillance, but it also exposed deep social and political divisions as public health measures became flashpoints in cultural and ideological battles. Beyond these headline-grabbing pandemics, the modern era has seen a quieter but equally serious threat emerge: antimicrobial resistance, AM. Decades of overuse and misuse of antibiotics in human medicine, agriculture, and livestock production have driven the evolution of superbugs, resistant to multiple drugs. Diseases once easily treated, like gonorrhea, tuberculosis, and certain hospital-acquired infections, are becoming harder and sometimes impossible to cure. The World Health Organization warns that a mere could cause up to 10 million deaths annually by 2050 if left unchecked, potentially ushering in a post-antibiotic era in which routine surgeries and minor infections once again carry lethal risk. Combating AIM-RARE requires coordinated global action, including better stewardship of existing drugs, investment in new antibiotics, and alternative treatments such as phage therapy. Looking forward, pandemic risk is likely to remain a permanent feature of human existence. Climate change is expanding the range of disease vectors like mosquitoes and ticks, potentially exposing new populations to malaria, dengue, chikungunya, and Lyme disease. Deforestation and habitat destruction bring humans into closer contact with wildlife reservoirs of novel pathogens, increasing the chances of spillover events like those that sparked HIV, Ebola, and SISI. The intensification of agriculture, globalized trade, and ever faster travel mean that once a pathogen emerges, it can spread globally with unprecedented speed. Advances in biotechnology, while offering tools for prevention and treatment, also raise concerns about accidental or deliberate release of engineered pathogens. Yet humanity is not powerless. The lessons of past pandemics, from the Black Death to COVID-19, underscore the importance of surveillance, transparency, international cooperation, and investment in public health infrastructure. Vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics are more advanced than ever, and new technologies like mRNA platforms, AI-driven drug discovery, and portable genomic sequencing hold promise for even faster responses to emerging threats. But science alone cannot defeat pandemics. Political will, public trust, and global solidarity are equally essential. The challenge of the 21st century will be to turn hard-won knowledge of history into sustained preparedness, so that if the next pandemic comes, humanity will meet it not with panic and improvisation, but with resilience and resolve. From the ancient plagues that toppled empires to the viral outbreaks of our own time, the history of pandemics is both a chronicle of devastation and a testament to human ingenuity. Each wave of disease has left scars, but also spurred progress, forcing societies to innovate in medicine, sanitation, governance, and compassion. The story is not one of victory or defeat, but of an ongoing contest in which humans and microbes adapt in response to one another. As the world moves deeper into the 21st century, the question is not whether pandemics will continue. They will, but whether we will remember the lessons etched by centuries of loss and act on them before the next invisible enemy arrives.